Marcus Hayes, at 39 years old, with an annual salary of $61,000 as a senior HVAC technician, understood the physics of cold. He knew how it crept through single-pane glass, how it found the smallest cracks in a door frame, how it settled deep into a person's bones. He did not expect to be studying its effects from the driver's seat of his own 2015 Honda Accord, parked in the driveway of the house he co-owned on Christmas Eve. The temperature display on his dashboard read a brutal 28 degrees. His wife, Denise, had delivered the news with the casual dispassion of a flight attendant announcing a delay. "My parents are taking the guest room," she'd said, not looking up from her phone, "and Mom's been having trouble with her back, so I told her she and Dad could have our bed. The couch is just too lumpy." Marcus had stood in the hallway of their Ardmore home, the scent of pine from their 7-foot, $150 Christmas tree filling the air. He could hear her father, Harold, laughing in the living room, a booming, arrogant sound that always seemed to take up too much space. "Okay," Marcus said slowly. "So, where do I sleep?" Denise finally looked at him, her brow furrowed with impatience, as if he were a particularly slow-witted child. Her elegant twists, which he'd always loved, seemed to frame a face he no longer recognized. "I don't know, Marcus. Figure it out. The car is heated, isn't it?" The suggestion was so outrageous, so utterly devoid of warmth or partnership, that he couldn't form a response. He just stared. A few minutes later, as he was grabbing a spare pillow and a comforter from the linen closet, Harold appeared. He was a tall, imposing man whose expensive clothes, tonight a $900 cashmere sweater, hung loosely on a frame that had gone soft with a life of leisure. He was holding a thin, cheap-looking blanket, the kind you might find in the trunk for emergencies. It was probably a $15 item from a discount store. Harold pushed it into Marcus's hands. His expression wasn't one of malice, but something far worse. Complete and utter indifference. "Here," he said, his voice smooth and low. "Heard you were roughing it tonight." He gestured with his chin toward the driveway. "The car probably fits your budget better anyway, Marcus." The words landed like stones. "Fits your budget." The phrase echoed in the frozen air of the hallway, a perfect encapsulation of 10 years of marriage, of 1,000 tiny cuts, of the vast, unbridgeable gulf between his world and theirs. He was the man who fixed things, the man with grease under his fingernails and a steady, reliable paycheck. They were people of taste, of status, of a phantom wealth that had evaporated years ago but left behind its expensive, demanding ghost. And the most brutal irony of all, the one that made the cold in his car feel like a physical assault, was that he was the one keeping their ghost alive. He was the guarantor on their $4,200 a month luxury apartment in Rittenhouse Square. He was the man whose signature, whose good credit, whose steady $61,000 a year income was the bedrock upon which their entire performance of affluence was built. He had facilitated access to a $74,000 family fund that was supposed to be their bridge back to stability. Instead, it had become a slush fund for their egos, and he, the facilitator, was being sent to sleep in a car. He had no idea then, sitting in the freezing dark, that their casual cruelty had just handed him the very key to his own liberation. But a reckoning was coming, and it would arrive in a plain white envelope. We all have a story about a time we felt small. A moment someone tried to put a price tag on our worth. What's the most outrageous thing someone has ever said to you? Share your story in the comments below, because sometimes turning those moments into strength is the best revenge. The early years with Denise had felt like sunlight. He'd met her at a friend's barbecue in West Philadelphia. He was 29, just starting to build his reputation as a reliable HVAC guy. She was 27, working as an administrative assistant for a law firm, and she had a laugh that could make a whole backyard feel brighter. She was beautiful, with deep brown skin that seemed to glow and a sharp intelligence that challenged him. Her family, the Parkers, were from a different world, a world of debutante balls, generational memberships at the Marion Cricket Club, and a sprawling mainline home that had been in their family for a century. Marcus, who grew up in a tidy row home in southwest Philly, the son of a city bus driver and a school teacher, was intimidated, but also enchanted. He thought their differences were a strength. He was practical. She was a dreamer. He knew how to fix a faulty compressor. She knew which fork to use for the fish course. When they married, they bought a modest 3-bedroom, 2-bath house in Ardmore for $350,000. To Marcus, it was a palace. He spent his weekends landscaping the small yard, replacing the old water heater himself, and building shelves in the garage. He was building a life, a foundation. Denise's parents, Harold and Eleanor, had tolerated him with a kind of polite condescension that always left a bitter aftertaste. In their eyes, he was a project, a tradesman Denise had inexplicably chosen. At family dinners in their cavernous, museum-like home, Harold would ask him questions about his work with a detached curiosity, as if studying an interesting insect. "So, Marcus, you were in a crawl space today? Fascinating. Tell me, what does one wear for such an occasion?" The questions were always followed by a thin smile and a quick change of subject. The facade of their wealth was impeccable. Eleanor wore $2,000 Chanel suits to charity luncheons, and Harold drove a new $90,000 Mercedes S-Class every 2 years. Marcus felt the gap in their finances acutely. His most prized possession was his set of Milwaukee power tools, a $2,500 investment in his livelihood. His watch was an $89 Timex, reliable and unpretentious. Denise, caught between two worlds, began to drift toward theirs. She started buying $600 handbags and complaining about their starter home. "It's just so small, Marcus," she'd sigh after a weekend at her parents'. "Don't you want more?" Then, about 3 years ago, the facade had cracked. A series of bad investments Harold had made, which he'd always bragged about at the dinner table, imploded. The specifics were murky, wrapped in layers of shame and denial. But the result was catastrophic. The mainline house was sold to cover the debts. The Mercedes was repossessed. Suddenly, the Parkers, who had never worried about a bill in their lives, were functionally destitute. It was during this crisis that Marcus, in a moment of genuine compassion, stepped in. A distant aunt of Eleanor's had left a trust fund, a sum of just over $100,000. It was tied up in legal complexities that Harold, in his pride and panic, couldn't navigate. Marcus, with his methodical, practical mind, spent weeks on the phone with lawyers and accountants. He organized the paperwork. He figured out the tax implications. He managed to get the funds, a total of $74,000 after fees and taxes, released into a manageable account. He had done it to help, to see the relief on Denise's face, to finally prove his worth to her parents in a language they understood: money. They were grateful for a time, but their gratitude quickly curdled back into entitlement. They didn't want a sensible apartment in a quiet suburb. They wanted to maintain appearances. They found a stunning 2-bedroom apartment in a glass tower on Rittenhouse Square. The rent was a staggering $4,200 a month. "We can't afford that," Marcus had said to Denise, looking at the numbers. The $74,000 fund, meant to be a lifeline for several years, would be drained in just over a year on rent alone. "It's not we, Marcus. It's them," Denise had snapped. "And they need this. It's about their dignity. After the humiliation they've been through." The landlord for the Rittenhouse property, a large, faceless corporation, required a guarantor with sterling credit and a proven income. The Parkers had neither. All eyes turned to Marcus. Denise had presented him with the paperwork one evening. "It's just a formality," she'd said, her voice soft and persuasive. "The rent will be paid from their fund. Your name is just on the paper to get them approved. It won't cost you a thing." He remembered the weight of the pen in his hand. He remembered the little box next to the line, lease guarantor. He had trusted her. He had signed his name, pledging his own financial stability as collateral for their pride. He thought he was signing a document of support. In reality, he was signing his own sentence, underwriting the very lifestyle that would be used to humiliate him, culminating in a cold Christmas night in the car he was still making payments on. He was the silent, invisible engine powering their fantasy, and they didn't even have the decency to offer him a place on their couch. The cruelty didn't begin on Christmas Eve. It had been a slow, creeping rot for years. The loss of their fortune didn't humble Harold and Eleanor. It made them bitter and even more desperate to project an image of superiority. And Marcus was the most convenient target for that desperation. One Saturday, about 6 months after they had moved into the Rittenhouse apartment he was guaranteeing, Denise insisted they have her parents over for dinner. Marcus spent the afternoon cooking. He made his signature braised short ribs, a dish that took 5 hours of slow, careful work. He bought a decent $25 bottle of Cabernet Sauvignon. He wanted the evening to be pleasant. He wanted to feel like a family. Harold arrived, took one look at the bottle on the counter and chuckled. "Cabernet," he said, drawing out the word. "How rustic." "Eleanor and I have been enjoying a lovely Bordeaux lately, a 2015 Chateau Margaux. It runs about $1,500 a bottle. But you can really taste the difference." He said it with a wink, as if letting Marcus in on a wonderful secret, but the message was clear. Your best effort is our pocket change. Throughout dinner, he peppered Marcus with questions about his job. "So, I have to ask," Harold began, delicately dabbing his mouth with a napkin, "when you're working on one of those large commercial units, on a rooftop in August, do you ever just look over the city and think, there's a whole world of finance and law and ideas down there that I'm not a part of?" Marcus felt the heat rise in his neck. "No, Harold," he said, his voice level. "I usually think about the hundreds of people in the building below who are counting on me to keep them from having a heat stroke. I think about getting the job done right." Eleanor, who had been silent, gave a tinkling little laugh. "Oh, Harold, stop teasing him. Marcus is very essential." She said the word essential like it meant unskilled. Denise just sat there, swirling the $25 wine in her glass, a pained expression on her face. She didn't defend him. She never defended him. Her silence was a betrayal all its own, a quiet endorsement of her parents' condescension. The insults became more frequent, more brazen. They began to treat Marcus not as a son-in-law, but as an unpaid handyman. One Tuesday, he got a frantic call from Denise. "Dad's new espresso machine is making a weird noise. Can you go over there? He's having guests tonight." Marcus was in the middle of a complex installation in a new office building downtown. "Denise, I'm on a job. I can't just leave. Tell him to call the manufacturer." "He already did. They can't send someone for a week," she said, her voice rising in panic. "His friends are coming over. It's a $3,000 Jura E8 machine, Marcus. He can't just serve them drip coffee." He felt a surge of white-hot anger. A $3,000 coffee machine, bought with the money he had secured for them, and he was being ordered to leave his own paying job to service it. "Denise, that's not my problem." "Some husband you are," she'd muttered before hanging up. He later found out she paid another technician $250 for an emergency service call, and then complained to Marcus for a week about the unnecessary expense he had caused. The humiliations were not just verbal, they were logistical. His 2015 Honda Accord became their unofficial city vehicle. They would borrow it for a day of shopping on Walnut Street, justifying it by saying parking their non-existent car in the city was a nightmare. One Friday, they returned it late, just as Marcus was getting ready to leave for a weekend fishing trip he'd been planning for months. The gas light was on. A new, deep scratch marred the passenger side door, and a half-eaten, greasy bag of expensive gourmet popcorn was crushed into the floor mat. "What happened to the door?" Marcus asked, his voice tight. Harold barely glanced at it. "Valet must have done it," he said dismissively, jingling the keys. "You should really think about getting a new car, Marcus. Something with a bit more presence." He didn't offer to pay for the gas, let alone the repair, which Marcus later found out would cost him $850 out of pocket. The final straw before Christmas came when he overheard Eleanor on the phone with one of her friends. He was in the garage, putting away his tools, and she was in the kitchen, her voice carrying through the open door. "Oh, it's just dreadful, Carol," she was saying. "We have to go to his family's for Thanksgiving. The house is the size of a postage stamp, and you can just imagine the food. Casseroles, darling. So many casseroles. One must endure, I suppose. It's for Denise's sake." He stood there, frozen, the cold metal of a wrench in his hand. His mother's sweet potato casserole, the one she'd been making for 40 years, the one that filled their small, loving house with the smell of cinnamon and warmth, was being mocked by a woman living in a palace he was paying for. Each of these moments was a stone laid on his chest. By the time Christmas Eve arrived, the weight was unbearable. When Harold looked at him with those dead, indifferent eyes and said, "The car probably fits your budget better anyway," it wasn't just an insult. It was the final, crushing stone. He walked out of the house, the cheap $15 blanket in his hand, and didn't look back. He sat in the driver's seat of his scratched, empty-tanked car, the engine running just for the weak warmth of the heater, and watched the happy, golden lights of the house where his wife was sleeping in a warm bed. And for the first time, he didn't feel sadness or anger. He felt a profound and terrifying nothing, a cold, clear, absolute void. The love he'd nurtured for a decade had finally and completely died. The night in the car was a descent into a new kind of reality. Marcus leaned the driver's seat back as far as it would go, the headrest pushing uncomfortably against the rear seat. He wrapped the thin polyester blanket Harold had given him around his legs, but it offered almost no protection against the invasive cold. The Honda's heater, even running full blast, could only do so much against the 28-degree air pressing in on all sides. Every 15 minutes, the engine would shudder as the thermostat kicked in, a reminder that he was burning through the last quarter tank of gas he couldn't afford to waste. He could see the house perfectly from his vantage point. The windows of the master bedroom, his master bedroom, were dark. Denise and her mother were presumably asleep in the $3,000 king-sized bed he'd spent a full Saturday assembling. Downstairs, the living room light was still on, a warm, inviting yellow that felt like a personal mockery. He could picture Harold in the leather armchair Marcus had bought, swirling a glass of expensive liquor that had probably been purchased with the fund money, feeling perfectly at home. At 1:17 a.m., a freezing rain began to fall. It wasn't a downpour, but a miserable, persistent ticking against the windshield and roof. Each tiny impact sounded like a judgment. Tick. You are not worthy. Tick. You are not welcome. Tick. This is what you get. He watched the raindrops freeze into intricate crystalline patterns on the glass, distorting the view of the house, making it look like a warped, unreachable dream. The world was sealing him out. He tried to sleep, but his body was rigid with cold and resentment. His mind replayed a decade of slights, a highlight reel of condescension. Harold's comments about his trade, Eleanor's pitying sighs. Denise's constant, silent complicity. He thought about his own parents in their postage stamp house in Southwest Philly. He knew what was happening there right now. His father would be asleep in his favorite recliner,